If Michael Venom Page had spent as much time on his grappling, both defense and offense, as he spent on dumb things like creating an entire song called BBL Gary, or on his dance routine as he walked to the octagon, he would have easily come out the winner of this fight. But instead, he put on one of the most head-scratching performances that I've seen in a while, and worst of all, he seemed perfectly happy to lose this fight. So in this video, I'm going to cover why this fight was such a massive disappointment, and I'm going to share with you my key observations for each of these guys with regards to what we learned about them and where they go from here. But really quick, if you find that you enjoy the video, please give it a like, and if you're not subscribed to the channel, consider doing that as well. I would love to have you here for future content. And as always, all the segments of this video will be timestamped down in the progress bar. So if I had to pick only one word to describe this fight, it would be disappointment. I have been hyping this fight for several months now because I wanted to see how Ian Garry's striking would match up against one of the best strikers in the entire division. Now, we definitely did learn some things about that, and I will cover that in a bit, but overall, this fight just did not live up to the excitement or the potential that it had, and quite frankly, I found it to be a boring waste on many different levels. I don't think that either one of these guys came out of this fight looking good, and I would go so far as to say this was probably the peak of Michael Venom Page's MMA career. So I think the best way that I can lay this out is to go through for each person all the different observations that I had from this fight and then relate it back to things that happened during it. So starting with MVP, I think the first thing that I can point out, which is a compliment, is the fact that he was the faster and the better striker. In my videos leading up to this, I said that MVP was going to take away some of the advantages that Ian Garry was used to having in his fights, and one of those was his speed. And after watching this, I don't think anybody could disagree that MVP is in fact the faster striker. MVP landed many more significant strikes that actually looked like significant strikes, whereas the ones landed by Ian Garry on MVP might have been counted as significant strikes, but they didn't look like they had any impact at all. So the one compliment I'm going to give MVP on this entire list is definitely the fact that he is the better striker of these two guys. But moving on now to my other observations, which are not complimentary, is number 2, that MVP is undoubtedly the worst grappler in the entire welterweight division. The only compliment that I will give him in this regard is the fact that he was able to fend off that rear naked choke, but I think that's much more a fault of Ian Garry than it is a compliment of MVP, and I will get to that later. I was getting so frustrated watching him grapple because he wasn't doing anything of value whatsoever, even when he had opportunities to do so. He would have easily won the third round if, when he had the top position, he at least tried to throw one single strike. But he didn't do that, and instead he let Ian Garry from the bottom hit him several times when there was zero risk if he had made his own attempt to strike as well. On top of that, later in the round when Ian Garry had his back and he was bent over, you could even hear the frustration in the commentator's voice, basically talking about all the different things he should be doing to get him out of that position, and all he did was stand there with Ian Garry hanging halfway off his back. It was just a sad and ridiculous performance from that standpoint from MVP, and it's just very, very frustrating to see. Now moving on to number 3, it became obvious that MVP was perfectly content to lose. I would never have guessed that in the lead up to this fight, but after I saw his performance at the press conference, I started to get a feeling that maybe MVP wasn't going to bring it, and in fact, I made a post on my channel where I pointed out that he lost the press conference battle, and I hoped that wasn't a harbinger for his upcoming performance. But unfortunately, it was, and MVP did not show up to this fight with a fire to win it. And one of the telltale signs of that was when we were waiting for the decision and people were not quite sure which way it was going to go, you could already tell that MVP had given the fight to Garry because he started to clap for Ian before the decision was even announced. But all the while that MVP is doing nothing to signify that he thought he won the fight, Ian Garry's walking around with his hands up, clearly indicating that he thought he won the fight. So MVP's overall lack of interest in getting his hand raised here was just really confusing for me. Now moving on to number 4, I'm going to criticize him for way too much focus on really stupid stuff. If MVP had put as much time into his grappling offense and his grappling defense as he did into dumb things like creating an entire song, which you really couldn't hear on the broadcast anyway, he would have easily gotten his hand raised in this fight. In addition to my concern after his performance at the press conference, I also got concerned when I started to see a lot more interviews from him than I was seeing pop up from Ian Garry. Now, maybe that just has to do with YouTube and the way it fed me stuff through the algorithm, but it just felt like Michael Venom Page was doing way more media than Ian Garry was, and perhaps if he had taken more of that time to actually focus on getting ready for the fight, maybe he could have had a much better outcome. And that leads me into number 5, which is that I'm now pretty confident that MVP is going to be nothing more than a gatekeeper at welterweight. If he wasn't willing to focus as much as he needed to on winning this fight, then he's not going to focus enough on winning any other fights either. And with that said, moving on to number 6, and I say this only half jokingly, I think it's probably time that MVP start kicking around the idea that his best move after the UFC is going to be over to karate combat. And while I'm definitely interested in him trying to redeem himself in the UFC and believe there are a bunch of fun matchups left for him there, he's never going to advance up the chain any further with his grappling ability. But it's very clear that he's still one of the best strikers in the world, and with his style, he could be for karate combat what Mike Perry has been for bare-knuckle boxing. Or maybe, just maybe, he could put the hard work into trying to get good at grappling defense. So now that I have bashed on MVP quite a bit, let me shift over to Ian Garry. And starting off with number 1, I will compliment him by saying he's gotten very good at exploiting the weaknesses of his opponents and finding a way to win. With Jeff Neal, he knew that Jeff was slow and smaller, but had big power, so he just took advantage of the fact that he's much faster, and he danced around for 3 rounds to avoid taking any serious damage. With MVP, he knew he wasn't going to have the speed advantage, so he instead went to the one area where he knows MVP is very weak, and that's the grappling. Now, as he gets closer to the championship position, I think his ability to do this is going to get much harder because the guys at the very top do not have these areas that he will be able to exploit. And that leads me to my next observation, which is that Ian Garry is going to increasingly become a boring fighter as his competition gets better. Now that he has MVP out of his way, he's back to probably being one of the fastest guys in the division with the ability to manage distance. And so as he moves closer to the title, I think he's going to just be focused on winning these point battles and staying out of danger as much as he can. And in my opinion, that's really the only shot he's going to have at actually winning a title. And moving on to my third observation, his grappling at this point is nowhere near elite level. And if he ends up in that situation with somebody like Shavkat or Usman, he's going to get mangled. Because one thing that I noticed way back when I was first evaluating Ian Garry and reviewing all of his previous fights, and that I noticed again in this fight, is that he just does not have the physical strength to be a dominant grappler. And so while his technique will undoubtedly continue to improve, I don't see him ever having the physical ability to really hang with the best grapplers that there will be. And in most of the future fights that he's going to have, I don't think he's going to want to go the grappling route. Now, with regards to his striking, MVP did show that he is still hittable, although he has absolutely improved that area. And I will give Ian the compliment as well that his chin is better than I thought it was. He did take a couple of significant shots from MVP and did not seem to get rocked by them. And the last thing that I will say about Ian is that he definitely has a championship mindset. He's taking tough fights, he's calling out the best guys in the division, and he apparently has the confidence that he can beat all of them. So with all this said, where do these guys go from here? If I start with MVP, I think the path for him is a little less clear than the one for Garry. On the one hand, I would say force the fight between him and Stephen Thompson. I know these guys are friends and that they don't want to fight, but first of all, Dana is not a fan of that type of thing. And second of all, Stephen Thompson doesn't really have any good options right now, and nobody's even talking about him. And after last night, MVP is going to feel pretty irrelevant as well. So even though that fight could be really boring too, we can be sure that there's probably not going to be much grappling to interfere with the striking. But if that's not an option that will work, I say throw him in with one of the wrestlers and see if he can do what Stephen Thompson could not do, which is to show that you can defend wrestling enough to stay in your striking game. And finally, if all you want is an intriguing stylistic matchup, go ahead and throw him in with Jeff Neal and see if he can at least get a win back under his belt. Now, if we move over to Ian Garry, I've said for a long time that I do not think Colby Covington would want to fight Ian because he knows it's a tough matchup, and he doesn't like him, and he does not want to give him the opportunity to get a win over him. But I do feel like after this last performance, Colby will see that Ian Garry's ground game is not strong at all, and that if he can get in close and take him down, he can easily grind out a decision. So now that we have all seen that, I would not be surprised if that fight came back on as a possibility. And if it's not Colby, then I sure hope that they do the Shavkat fight. It seemed like they were kind of waiting for Shavkat's injury to recover as well as Jack Della Maddalena's, and that they were then going to book those two, but maybe it's possible that this whole event now changes that dynamic a little bit. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on this fight and what should be done next. Please let me know down in the comments what you thought about this fight and what should be next for both MVP and Ian Garry. I will look forward to hearing what you have to say, and as always, I really appreciate you being here. Please remember, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and until the next time, have a great rest of your day.